We are in the final week of a sermon series that we've been doing called 90. The reason why it's called 90 is because for about the span of 90 days, what we've been doing is we've been journeying through the life of Jesus, taking a look at some of his most significant moments, his significant encounters, and some of his most significant conversations. We started in the place where he burst onto the pages of history as a man, and we're journeying through all the way to the place where we are today, where he ends up giving his life as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. And today is the end, but it's also the beginning. So previously on 90, last time I preached in the series, Jesus and his disciples had made their way to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. At this point in his ministry, Jesus is wildly popular. The crowds are growing larger and larger and larger by every passing moment, and everybody everywhere is talking about Jesus. And they believe that Passover is going to be the time when Jesus finally declares that he's the Messiah and that he's their king. And so excitement is everywhere. And when Jesus and his disciples get to Jerusalem, there's a crowd of people that have lined the streets on either side. They have palm branches. They're waving them in the air, and they're crying out, "Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna," which means save now. So they're saying to Jesus, save now, become our king. And they practically beg Jesus to become their king. Now, for the religious leaders, this is a problem because Jesus represents a threat to everything that they hold dear. He represents a threat to their power. He represents a threat to their influence. He even represents a threat to their wealth. And so for the last few months, the religious leaders have been doing everything that they could to separate Jesus from the crowd so that they could do something about getting rid of Jesus. But the more they tried, the harder it became because, again, the longer things went, the bigger and bigger and bigger the crowd became. And one day, the religious leaders find themselves in a meeting when somebody finally blurts out what everybody else is thinking. And here's what he says. He says, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." Now, a few days later, Jesus celebrates Passover meal with his disciples. And for the last 3 years of his ministry, he's been dropping clues and hints, kind of like breadcrumbs, about the new that he had come to bring. But he chooses the Passover meal to spell everything out with absolute clarity. So he sits down with his disciples and he tells them about a new covenant that he came to bring. The new covenant would be a new relational arrangement between God and mankind. It would be the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, and it would represent the end of God's covenant that he had made with the nation of Israel. And this new covenant that Jesus came to bring, that he came to establish, that he rolled out to his disciples on that Passover meal, just like contracts have terms and conditions, ancient covenants had terms and conditions too. So Jesus in that same meal rolls out the terms and conditions of the new covenant, and here's what they were. It's something we call the new covenant command. And he tells them, look, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And this new covenant command would become the overarching governing ethic for Jesus' new movement. It would become the mark of the new covenant. And man, for the disciples, what a night. It starts out with Jesus telling them, hey, look, guys, you've always done this in remembrance of what God did when he freed your ancestors from Egypt and from Egyptian slavery. And guys, from now on, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. And then Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it up and he passes it around and he tells his guys, hey, guys, from here on out, this is going to represent my body, which is going to be given for you. And then he picks up the wine and he tells them, from here on out, guys, this is going to represent my blood, which is shed for you. And the disciples are so confused. They have no idea what Jesus is talking about. In fact, they don't even have a grid or a framework to even understand what Jesus is saying. They won't understand it until after the resurrection. But the disciples can tell that this is a pretty big deal, that something is going on, that something is up. But the problem is is that Jesus doesn't seem too up. Jesus seems concerned or maybe even worried, and everybody's wondering, where's Judas? Where did he go? When is he going to come back? Is he going to come back? And then at the end of the meal, Jesus invites his disciples. He says, look, let's go on a walk together. So they get up and they make their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane is, somebody's car's going off. The Garden of Gethsemane is an urban garden in the center of Jerusalem. And Jesus and his disciples make their way there at night so people don't know and can't see and can't bother them. And when they get there, Jesus tells his disciples, look, stay here and pray. I want to go a little bit farther in the garden and kind of pray by myself, but we'll both pray at the same time. So Jesus moves farther into the garden and he prays by himself, and he prays this agonizing prayer. He says, God, look, I don't really want to do this. If there's another way, I'd like to do it. But at the end of the day, look, if this is what you want me to do, not my will, but thine be done. He comes back to find his disciples sleeping. He wakes them up and he goes, guys, couldn't you just pray with me for an hour? Come on. And then all of a sudden, Judas shows up. But Judas isn't alone. He's brought a small army of temple guards with him. And then literally everything falls apart. They try to arrest Jesus. Peter defends Jesus, and Jesus rebukes Peter for doing it. And then Jesus does something that nobody expects. He just simply surrenders. And the disciples are shocked. And they're scared. And they don't know what to do. So the text tells us that everyone deserted him and fled. They, talking about the guard, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. For many of these religious leaders, this is the closest they have ever been in their entire life to Jesus. For many of them, this is as close. They've never been close enough to reach out and touch Jesus. They've never even been close enough, many of them, to even look Jesus in the eye. And so when they see Jesus in this situation, they all gather together. And they become curious. And Jesus, he's caged and he's alone. And this is the first time that there's ever been more of them than there have been of Jesus and Jesus' constituency. And all of a sudden, they become extraordinarily emboldened by the situation. Now, what happens next in the Gospels, in the story of Jesus, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is recorded for us in extraordinary detail. The story continues. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. So they hauled Jesus off to this sham of a trial. And people start testifying against Jesus, and they say that he said things he never said. They say he did things that he never did. And the truly sad part is nobody's story matches up. Everybody can tell the whole thing is just purely for show, and it's completely driven by a motive and an agenda. They ask Jesus questions, and Jesus refuses to answer. And then we read this. Then the high priest stood up. The high priest is the most powerful man in the room. He finally gets fed up with the whole thing, so he stood up before them and he asked Jesus directly, look, are you not going to answer? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. So the high priest, he tries again. He says again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? The high priest gets upset, and so he asks Jesus a direct question. He asks Jesus a question that everybody wants to know the answer to. He asks Jesus the one question that if Jesus answers the way that they hope he answers, that they can do what they want to do with Jesus. There is so much that hangs in the balance in this moment. And everybody knows it. In this very moment, Jesus held his future in his hands, and he held your future in his hands too. I imagine it was so quiet in the room that you could literally hear a pin drop. Everybody was waiting. And then Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes, which is a sign of mourning and extreme emotion. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. We don't need any more evidence. You have heard the blasphemy. They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. They had figured out Jesus' guilt. They had managed to get that. And now they had to decide, how are we going to get Rome to do what we need them to do? So the religious leaders stayed up all night long, debating and arguing, trying to find the best way, the best plan to try to get Rome to do their bidding. And after working it over all night long, their plan became to try to get Pilate to do what they wanted him to do. But they needed him to do it quickly. They needed him to do it before sunset. They needed him to do it before Passover so that hopefully everything could calm down. So hopefully everybody could move on and they could kind of get over this whole Jesus thing and this Jesus hysteria that everybody was experiencing. So they bound Jesus and they led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now the interesting thing is that Pilate is the governor and has been the governor of Samaria and Judea for 7 years. Judea is the area in which Jerusalem was at. He was appointed as the governor of those areas by Tiberius Caesar himself. But Pilate cannot stand, according to history, Pilate couldn't stand the Jewish people. In fact, he didn't even live in or around Jerusalem. He lived on the coast, and the only reason he was even in Jerusalem at this time is because Passover had a long history of crazy things happening and people getting wound up. And so Pilate has come to Jerusalem merely to keep the peace. And then as soon as it's over, his plans are to go home. He couldn't stand the Jewish people, but he loved to watch them beg and grovel. And they hated to go to Pilate for anything. But Pilate was their best chance. By now, it was early morning. And to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. The Jewish people had a rule. And the rule stated that if you went into the home of a Gentile, that you were considered to be unclean. And the religious leaders, they'd already gone through the ceremonial rituals and the ceremonial cleansings to get ready for Passover. And so when they go see Pilate, they don't even want to go in the door because they don't want to have to go through all those rituals all over again. And I think at this point, it's worth pausing to make note of the hypocrisy of the moment. These men won't even cross a threshold, but they're about to insist that Jesus be crucified. So Pilate came out to them and asked. He came out to them because he really didn't have a choice. What charges are you bringing against this man? So they responded, look, if he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. In other words, Pilate, come on, man, let's not do this song and dance. We've done this before with you, and we don't like you, and you don't like us. Look, we wouldn't be here if we didn't absolutely have to be. Look, this is important. Let's just not get bogged down in the details, Pilate. For once, can you just do us a solid? So Pilate responds, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Pilate is going to enjoy this interaction. If he has to deal with the Jewish people, he's definitely going to enjoy the interaction, because what he wants here, and the reason why he said that is because he wants them to beg, and he wants them to grovel, and he wants them to acknowledge Rome's sovereignty over them. So he says something that he knows will make them say what they say next. But we have no right to execute anyone. And Pilate's like, oh, that's right. You can't even enforce your own laws. That's a pity. Then we read, Pilate went back inside the house or his palace, and he summoned Jesus. So Pilate decides to do something that he knows will further bother the religious leaders. And he invites Jesus into his palace to question him himself, where the religious leaders can't hear what's going on. And he knows it's going to bug them. And they're out there and they're nervous because they can't hear what's being said or the conversation that's being had. And Jesus has a way with people. I mean, he has managed to convince a lot of people to really like him and to really follow him. And they're worried about how this interaction might go. When Jesus gets in there, Pilate asks him, look, are you the king of the Jews? The reason why Pilate asked him that question is because Pilate's the governor of the area. It's his job to make sure that people and things stay sort of peaceable. I mean, it's how he stays in good with his boss. And he's heard the rumors. He's heard about what Jesus has taught. He's heard about what Jesus has done. He's heard about the crowd that grows bigger and bigger and bigger every single day. He's heard about how when Jesus came into Jerusalem just a few days prior, where people practically begged him to become king. And so Pilate has a vested interest, and he asks him, look, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus responds, look, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? Then Pilate says, look, am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done? Look, man, you got to work with me. You got to give me something. I didn't turn you over to me. I didn't create this situation. Your people did. So Jesus decides to go back to the original question. And here's what Jesus says. He says, look, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. He tells Pilate, look, Pilate, come on, man. I'm not the type of king you're thinking about, and you know it. Because if I were that type of king, Pilate, I would do what most people do. I would assert my power, I would assert my dominance, and we would take things by force. So Pilate responds, oh, you're a king then. Finally, we're getting somewhere. So Pilate goes back out to the accusers, and here's what he does. He tells them, look, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. Now, I'm sure, we don't know who said it, but I'm sure whoever said it, as soon as he brought Galilee into it, I'm sure he wanted to kick himself for saying that. Because as soon as Pilate heard that word Galilee, he saw another opportunity to frustrate the religious leaders. We won't read it together today, but Pilate essentially goes, oh, Galilee. Well, Galilee isn't my jurisdiction. That's Herod's jurisdiction. You need to take Jesus to Herod. So they take Jesus to Herod, and Herod is excited about Jesus. He hasn't been able to talk to him, but he's heard a whole lot about him. And when Jesus comes in, Herod tries to get Jesus to do some tricks. Jesus refuses, and eventually Herod gets bored when he doesn't get what he wants out of the thing, and he doesn't see what he wants to see out of the thing. And so he sends him back to Pilate. And Pilate once again gathers the accusers. And he tells them, look, you brought this man to me as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. And by the way, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, again, he's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with him! Away with him! Away with him!" Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. First century readers knew exactly what flogged meant, because it happened all the time in their world. Normally, what would happen when a person was flogged is they would strip them naked, and then they would take their hands and they would tie them up above their head to a post as far as they could, so to stretch the person out and immobilize them. And then a Roman centurion would stand on either side of the person being flogged, and they would have a cat of nine tails in their hands. It was a whip. They had these leather thongs, and in those thongs were pieces of glass and pieces of bone and metal and rocks. And they would take turns hitting the person with it. And that glass and that metal would dig into a person's body, into their flesh. And it would rip the flesh off layer by layer by layer, all the way to the bone. From their shoulders all the way down their legs and their back. There are stories of people who were flogged where after they were flogged, you could see their entire spinal column. There are stories of people when they were flogged, they were disemboweled in the process. It was horrible. In fact, it was so horrible that somebody would be there and to count the number of strikes that a person got. Because they knew once you got to about 40, most people couldn't survive that. But people died all the time from flogging, from blood loss, from infection. And it's at this point in the story where I want to kind of pause again and I want to make an observation. Most of us, when we talk about what happens to Jesus next, when we tell the story, we sanitize it and we romanticize it. And I think the reason why we do that is because oftentimes, when the first times we hear it, or oftentimes when we tell it, we're telling it to children. We're probably smart to do a little bit of that with children. We kind of have this PG or PG-13 version of what happened. But when as adults, we still romanticize it and we still sanitize it and we still tell that PG-13 version, I'm afraid that if that's what we stick to, we end up missing the story entirely. Because the reality is, all of us, if we were there, we would all look away. We would not be able to watch. The text continues. The soldier twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again and again and again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate goes out to the accusers and he says, "Look." And I think the reason Pilate did that is because he's trying to elicit pity. He brings Jesus out and he lets them see what kind of physical condition he's in. And they say, "Look," he says, "Look." And with that simple word, he's trying to communicate, I think, look, I mean, if he was going to be some kind of whatever you think he is, the chances of that now are pretty slim, don't you think? Look, he probably isn't going to even live. Can't we drop this? Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know, again, guys, I find no basis for a charge against him. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I know I sound like a broken record. I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jewish leaders decided, man, we gotta really take it to the next level. We gotta enact phase 2 of our plan. So they insisted, look, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Now, the reason why Pilate was afraid is because as soon as they used that phrase, Son of God, the conversation became completely different. That phrase, Son of God, intersected with some things in the Roman world, and Pilate knew that as soon as that phrase was brought in, that this was a game changer, and all of a sudden the stakes are higher. So Pilate, he has his guards bring Jesus in, and he questions Jesus, and Jesus doesn't respond. So Pilate says, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or to crucify you? Pilate is so amazed at what he sees here. He has never seen anything like this, because this is the point where most people grovel and beg for a quick death. So he says, look, Jesus, don't you understand what's going on here? Don't you understand that I have the power to make a decision that seriously impacts you in this moment? And Jesus could have responded by going, then why are you the one who's so afraid? But here's what Jesus says. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Pilate had seen a whole lot of things in his life. He'd seen men in war, men die in battle. Some of them die quickly, some of them die slowly and agonizingly. He'd seen hundreds of people flogged, but he had never seen anything like this before. When he looked across the room into the eyes of Jesus, they weren't crazy eyes. They were sincere. They were courageous. They were fearless. So the story goes, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept on shouting. They decided, oh man, this isn't working out how we thought it would. We've got to enact phase 3 of the plan. So they shouted out, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Checkmate. Pilate had been outmaneuvered, and his hands were tied, because Pilate knew that Tiberius Caesar had spies everywhere, eyes and ears everywhere. And if he didn't do something about this, word would get back around to Caesar, the most powerful man in the world that had no qualms whatsoever with ending a person's life. The story continues. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down, and there's so much detail. Sat down on the judge's seat, a place known as the stone pavement. It was about noon. And he looks at Jesus' accusers and he says, look, here is your king. To which they respond, take him away, take him away, crucify him. He responds and says, look, shall I crucify your king? And then in this moment, they cry out and they say something the religious leaders do that in any other circumstance, in any other situation, it would have been considered blasphemous. But they tell him, look, we have no king but Caesar. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, which was a mild pain reliever. It was a final act of pity or mercy that Jesus refused, but he did not take it. And you know what's interesting to me about the story is when you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, up to this point, there is so much detail in the story. And then when we get here, it all stops. Because what happened next needed no explanation. The text simply states, and they crucified him. Rome didn't invent crucifixion. It was actually invented by the Greeks. But Rome took it and did what Rome oftentimes did. They simply made it a lot better. They figured out a way to do crucifixion in such a way that someone would be in as much pain as possible for as long as possible. It was absolutely gruesome. In fact, it was so gruesome that the early church fathers banned it from early art in the Christian world until Constantine became emperor and he banned it as a form of capital punishment. In fact, C.S. Lewis says this: the crucifixion did not become a frequent motive of Christian art until the generation in which had seen real crucifixions were all dead. Throughout the course of human history, there have been many people who have died forcibly by crucifixion. But my friends, there's only one person who chose it. Only one. There's a song that states this. It says, "Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost." When Jesus died, there were no Christians. There weren't really even any followers. There were some sympathizers, but there weren't any Christians. Because Jesus had made some pretty incredible claims. He claimed to be the Son of God in his life. He claimed to be the resurrection and the life. He made so many claims where he was the Messiah. And the Messiah, the resurrection and life, the Son of God, you're not supposed to be able to kill them. So for many people, when Jesus died, there was no dream to keep alive, and there was no movement to keep moving. So after Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they get together and they approach Pilate, and they probably risk their lives to do it, but they ask to get Jesus' body so that they can bury it. Normally, people who were crucified, they weren't buried. They were just thrown onto a heap somewhere. Pilate agrees, and then we read, he was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. They do their work quickly. And finally, they get done just before sunset. And they make their way homes to their families to celebrate Passover. The next day, Pilate had the tomb sealed and guards posted outside. And that night, when everybody went to sleep, they slept well. Caiaphas, the high priest, slept well. He slept real good knowing that he had outmaneuvered Pilate. Pilate slept well that night, relieved. He doesn't have the pressure of that situation anymore. Tiberius Caesar sleeps well that night, completely unaware that anything had happened at all. All was as it always had been for them, and they thought the way it always would be. Because everyone expected Jesus to do what dead people usually do: stay dead. Little did they know, in the next few hours, the things that would happen would end up cementing their place in history. What would end up happening in the next few hours would end up ensuring that their names would be spoken of in gatherings for generation after generation after generation. But their place in history would not be what they would have chosen. They would end up being a footnote in the story of the rabbi from Galilee. Because what they expected to be the end was just the beginning. The beginning of something new. The beginning of something brand new for the world. And my friends, for you.